At a time when we are all wondering what upcoming days will bring, it's comforting to find bits of normalcy in the world. We found that this week with word of the first ship movements of the 2020 Great Lakes shipping season. Almanac North producer Greg Grell interviewed Jayson Hron of the Duluth Seaway Port Authority via webcam.
Jayson, thanks for being with us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
So we're at an exciting time of the year. The port is opening up for the season. Tell us about the first ship movement so far this week in the harbor.
It is definitely an exciting time of year. The Burns Harbor made its way out of the Superior entry in the wee hours on Sunday morning, and that kicked it off. Burns Harbor was actually the last vessel into the port for winter layup to conclude the 2019 season, and she was the first one out to begin the 2020 season. So she was on her way in the wee hours Sunday morning, and then a few more vessels have made their way out of the port in the days since then. So we're underway. And then with Wednesday's opening of the Soo locks, that opened the waterway for upbound traffic, and several ships locked through on Wednesday right after the locks opened up. So yeah, going both directions right now, and everything's moving as it should be.
So one thing unusual, different than last year is the lake is pretty much wide open. We're not really going to have much ice problem this year, are we?
That's true. So far, so good. The Coast Guard tells me that we are at a level of ice right now that is usually more commensurate with the second week of April. So things are definitely progressing really well on the ice front. There is still some ice moving around the lake, and some ships are having some tangles with that ice, but nothing too major at this point. And the Coast Guard is doing its thing with the assets it has to make sure that shipping moves as freely as it can. But definitely looking a lot better than we were last year at this time in terms of ice coverage.
So we know it's very early, Jayson, but what's the early outlook like for the shipping season?
You know, with seemingly everything in our world changing by the hour right now with COVID, it's difficult to really speculate on what total tonnages could be at the end of the season or anything like that. But so far, everything seems to be, mostly on schedule. Things are moving as they normally move. So it's been a pretty normal start to the shipping season, I guess, in that sense, in terms of the ships getting on their way and the tonnages moving. And, at this point, everybody's hoping that we can continue to do business as usual as much as possible. I think when you look at the maritime shipping industry as a whole, it puts the pasta on your plate and the phone in your pocket and the car in your garage. So it's a critical piece of cargo movement for North America. And we really, all of the industries involved and all of the agencies involved are doing everything they can to meet the challenge and keep that cargo moving as close to normal as possible at this point. So obviously time will tell whether there are larger effects of COVID-19 or anything else that may arise over the course of the season as it relates to tonnage. But so far, things seem to be off to a pretty good start.
Now, we talked, or you mentioned before we started the interview, that the Coast Guard is really in charge of any COVID-19 related activity. To your knowledge, besides just the unknown about how the economy is going to be affected, is there any specific rules or anything changed because of COVID-19, say amongst the crew, or how they interact in the port, that type of thing?
Definitely. Safety is the number one priority. Safety of the crews and the vessel operators, safety of the people shoreside that are helping the ships. So the Coast Guard and Centers for Disease Control are the lead agencies on it as it relates to COVID-19. And they definitely have been working 24/7 on preparations and procedures to try to ensure the greatest amount of safety possible. Those procedures really run the gamut of things in terms of not only the availability for crew and captain to embark or disembark from the vessels when they can, where they can, certain restrictions on that, and required reporting for vessels who may have crews and crew members who have potentially become symptomatic or had exposure to someone who may be symptomatic. There are procedures for mandated reporting in advance at various command centers for the Coast Guard and also with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and Centers for Disease Control. So they're mandated to report in advance if anybody is symptomatic or if anybody's had any exposure. And that happens even before any of the ship inspectors board vessels in port. So all of those things are in place, even down to certain documents weather documents being emailed to ship captains as opposed to delivered to them in hard copies and things like that. So definitely a lot of procedures and protocols in place to try to ensure safety for everyone involved.
So it's fair to say that the start of this shipping season is unique. This isn't like a typical season.
No, it's unprecedented in that regard for sure.
So I know it's early, but right now we're worried about, of course, what's going to happen with the economy. So we've got our big three, the iron ore, coal, and grain. And I know that we've been doing more and more wind turbine as well. Any long range projections right now that you're hearing about how any of those cargoes could be impacted?
So speaking specifically to the wind cargo, we do have several wind shipment deliveries scheduled for the port of Duluth Superior again this season. We're actually, prior to COVID-19, looking forward to potentially another record-breaking season for that particular type of cargo. And we certainly hope to still be able to achieve that despite the outbreak of this pandemic. So that will be kind of a wait and see. It's on the schedule. None of that was scheduled to arrive before May anyway. So at this point, everything's still scheduled as planned. As it relates to movement of iron ore and coal and some of the other major cargoes that we move through the port, the first shipment out was a load of iron ore, and we'll certainly have coal moving as well. So obviously all eyes are on the economy and what the effects of this might be. Certainly the optimistic side of things hopes that maybe the nation can be up and running sooner rather than later, but obviously not in a way that puts anybody at increased risk. So, unfortunately, about the best thing I can tell you is, like everything else, it's a little bit wait and see at this point.
No, early on there was maybe some confusion when the president talked about the potential impact on international shipping cargoes, and I think that was overstated. Is there going to be any impact as far as international shipping from, say, Europe to the United States?
What we know at this point is that the Montreal Lake Ontario section of the St. Lawrence Seaway will not open until April 1st this year. And that was actually related to the Lake Ontario outflow levels, not COVID-19. So no overseas vessels will be arriving in the port of Duluth Superior prior to that date. So that's the first element that's in place when it comes to international shipping, is that the Seaway won't actually open to international shipping until April 1st this year. Beyond that, it will be strictly with the Coast Guard and Centers for Disease Control, and I guess the binational government bodies as well, to make any declarations about what will happen with international shipping. But at this point, everything is still on schedule.
Now, port watchers have been really looking forward to the 2020 season because Great Lakes passenger ship traffic was scheduled to return to the Great Lakes. Any word at all right now on what impact COVID might have on that?
Right. Obviously, with cruise shipping being in the news with COVID-19, I mean, they're closely tied together at this point. So what we know right now regarding the Great Lakes cruising is that there is still a cruise ship scheduled to come to this port in June of this year. It has not been removed from the schedule yet. At this point, the government restrictions were for cruise ships exceeding 500 passengers. This cruise ship would have fewer than 500 passengers. At this point, it's still on the schedule to arrive. However, like everything else, I think to be determined on that.
What about the outlook for the port itself? Any major construction projects, dredging, things like that on the tap for this season?
Yeah, it's definitely set to be another exciting year for the port itself in terms of those kinds of projects. When the Port Authority was awarded the MARAD grant in February, that put us in position to be able to begin construction on a 56,000 square foot rail served warehouse, a new warehouse at the Clure Public Marine Terminal. So in addition to that, that project will also help us rehabilitate about 1,700 lineal feet of dock wall as well on berths 10 and 11. So with that funding, we'll be able to embark on some projects that'll be great for the Clure terminal and great for the region. They will help, those projects, especially the warehouse, will help provide greater cargo flexibility, more cargo space, obviously, and the ability for local producers and cargo owners to be able to have some cost savings in their supply chain.
And finally, recently, the Minnesota Department of Transportation announced that they were going to put the so-called can of worms rebuild project on hold. And I know that impacts the port because of the heavy lift cargoes. Can you talk about that a bit, Jayson?
Late last year, we heard word that the Garfield Avenue portion of the project, which was specifically dedicated to the oversized and overweight cargoes, for instance, wind cargo, was going to be deferred anyway, regardless of this most recent deferral announcement. So that aspect of the project we knew had been deferred. Obviously, the recent news that the project largely as a whole will be deferred was an add-on to that. I think from a port standpoint, we will continue to move cargo just the same way we've moved cargo over the last few years. The reality is that this deferral is not going to impede us from moving cargo. We'll just be moving it the same way we have over the last few years. But what we're looking forward to when the project is complete is more efficient cargo movement through the port and the benefits that will come from, I guess, having that can of worms emptied, so to speak.
All right. Well, Jayson, we really hope for a good shipping season and really appreciate your time today. This has been Jayson Hron, the Director of Communications and Marketing for the Duluth Seaway Port Authority. Thank you, Jayson.
You're welcome.